And we are live with our 152nd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. We're filming, or we're going live during the afternoon this time around, just because life happened this morning. Even though, life happens. That's all. But we're happy to be here. We're happy to discuss. We got a few items that we just wanted to talk through today. Don't have a massive agenda. I did want to mention a couple of things though. In the end of next week is B-Side Salt Lake City. If you're in the Salt Lake City metro area, please come by. We're going to be there. We'll be attending and supporting the local B-Sides community, but would love to match up or see people as we get into it. Outside of that, there's trying to remember what other conferences we have coming up, Ken, but there's a couple that we're going to submit to actually teach in person coming up in late winter, early spring. So watch for that. Once we know more and have more details on it, we will let you know.
Yeah, I've been kind of hesitant to really pursue going to any conferences and all of that, only because of the fact that things tend to you want to make travel plans, you want to get things kind of squared away in advance, and I don't feel like I can make plans and be guaranteed that the in-person part will still happen, especially this time of year, cold and flu season, basically like the right conditions for numbers to go up, and if numbers go back up, then they're going to cancel things. And so it's kind of just, I don't know, like when I say hesitant, it's just because like of the hassle of having to book things and then cancel things. And so it's just, I don't know, for me, I don't know about you, but unless it's local and easy to get to, I'm just kind of, and it's just kind of playing it by ear. Did last con already happened, right? Didn't it?
It did.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. I suppose the other thing too is the training aspect of it too. Like, is it a good place for us to train at? It's always a question as well. It's usually, one thing we like to do.
Yep. And it will just depend on, like Ken said, kind of what the numbers look like and whether or not it makes sense. But hopefully we'll get there at some point. We'll see people again.
Yeah, at some point soon, hopefully.
At some point soon. But otherwise, let's see. There was a couple of things that I did want to talk through. From a news perspective, I think it was just yesterday that GoDaddy announced their breach, right? Let's see, I've got a link to it here. Something like 1.2 million customers. Of course, it was all of the the managed WordPress instances, right? That I know that says 112 million, the link itself, but it's actually 1.2. I wondered what your thoughts were on this, right? Like we've kind of gotten away from reporting breaches just because it's. I don't know. I go back to what Jerry said. I think as a first guest on our episode on episode AppSec, with if a breach happens and no one reports it, no one cares. Did it really happen, right? And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, just from a general perspective, right? Like, are you as concerned about breaches nowadays outside of it happening to GitHub or to people that you're directly affected by? What are your general thoughts when something like this pops up? Are you surprised anymore? Are you concerned? Yeah, let me know.
Surprised? No. Are you asking me, or are you asking the?
No, I'm asking you, right?
Okay, sorry. I was like, wait, maybe you mean more generically than just the people watching. Yeah, for me, I'm not super surprised. Obviously, I am, however. Some of the things that concern me are anytime there's a breach of like passwords and things like that, that's always kind of concerning, right? Especially if it's like, I mean, obviously like tied to an account takeover situation with where I work. So, I mean, or could be. So that's always of concern. Also, like when SolarWinds came out, and I look at that as a breach as well. Maybe it's not a like breach in the sense of grabbing data and running, but rather, affecting the supply chain of that software, the entire supply chain of that software. Then yes, very much concerned, because a lot of the things that were affected by SolarWinds are technologies that are pretty common for, DevOpsy shops to use. And it causes quite a headache. That particular one caused quite a headache. Now, if it's just breaches like someone has IDOR again, I like it because it's a good example. I don't like that they got breached. I'm not saying or advocating for that, but I like those for the fact they give us examples of like, yeah, see, this is actually a problem. This is when we do our course, or if we're just like internally at my company, if I'm talking to developers or something like that. It's always nice to have examples to point to, though I don't wish for it. So is there such a thing as breach fatigue? I'm sure, probably people don't get up in arms as much. And the real question, Seth, is not what we as technologists think, but I think, or not a real question, but a different question that I'm interested in personally is what do the average people think of this, right? Like the average person that's not a technologist, what do they think, or doesn't work in security?
And that's a good question.
Have you talked to anyone that's like just a normie, as we'll call them?
Normie? A normie? Is that what we're calling him?
That's what I'll call them.
No, I mean, not really. Well, no, that's not true, right? I haven't asked specifically about this one, but when things are in the news, especially like from a breach perspective, 2-3 years ago, I would get people asking me about them, whether that's, my in-laws or just other non-technical, members of my family would ask. I don't think anything recently, like even though SolarWinds was huge, and it really does have a massive effect on the security of all these companies, no one asks anymore, right? I feel like we have reached breach fatigue with normal people. Like I see this from GoDaddy and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like they had this managed, WordPress stuff that was out there. And again, 1.2 million, but 1.2 million feels like peanuts at this point with the amount of data that's out there, right? And I'm like, okay, so it's great that GoDaddy reported it, that they saw it for a couple of months. And to be fair, they caught it after, 8 weeks or whatever, like however long that exposure was. And there's still some tuning to be done there. But I mean, had this happened 3-4 years ago, it would be all over the news. I'm pretty sure like it may not have hit like local news, but at the very least it would hit some of the national news channels. Nowadays, it's just like, oh, a tech site will report on it. We'll see it in, our news feeds, like our information security news feeds. But I don't really see much other activity around it. And I'm not getting people asking me about it, right? Like just in my circles that are outside of us, right? So I'm afraid that we have jumped on it too much in those initial phases, that people just don't care anymore, and they're not really resetting those passwords unless a website or an application is forcing them to do it.
Yeah, it's also probably like, well, maybe GoDaddy, maybe people have like stuff on GoDaddy, but I think like what would be if it was your Hulu, payment details, or your Netflix payment details, or what do people use, like Uber or Instacart or anything like that? Something that people, especially in today's world where like people are having to deal or use more often like services built for remote life, right? Something like that was breached, I feel like maybe people would care more. But it's like we sit there and we're like, oh, SolarWinds. Do people not understand how big of a deal that is? And they're like, what's a SolarWinds? Why would I?
What is SolarWinds? Yeah.
Is that a hammer? Like, what is that?
Oh, is it like a solar flare? Like it causes security
like,
issues, or I don't know. Yeah.
Some solar panel company. Yeah. I mean, the reality is much less savvy than you would think with, I mean, honestly though, even as a technologist is like, yeah, I know SolarWinds exists, but when's the last time I worked with, or at least consciously worked with SolarWinds, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, and that's what we run into, right? Like, yeah, it's definitely interesting to us, and there are issues associated with it, and that's kind of why I brought this up is I see this as a failure of GoDaddy for sure. They're going to fix it, or but every company gets hit by this, right? 1.2 million records is no longer a large breach. And these passwords, and it looks like some random stuff was it, the way that they were generating WordPress admin credentials. So it wasn't even really shared passwords or like user chosen passwords, right? It was these other, it was a randomly generated password by GoDaddy. So how valuable actually is that? I don't know. I'd be more concerned with some of the SSH credentials and other things that are going on there that came about that. Yeah, I don't know, man. Should we care anymore? Like, and maybe it's afternoon, and I'm a nihilist on a Tuesday afternoon today, but it just, yeah. No, what I did want to post was, I suggested that we just send this back across to them, right?
Yeah. No, I'm actually, to your point, actually, you made I guess when it would be, okay, so when I think it would be, because I'm looking at like what was actually breached, right? So active and inactive managed WordPress customers had their email addresses and customer number exposed. Don't think many people would care about that. The original WordPress admin password that was set at the time of provisioning was exposed, and if those were still in use, that would be an issue.
So
but
that's
that's
the random, right? Like that's random WordPress admin. It's not a Anyway, yep.
Yeah. So unless any of this really gives you, none of this really gives them any for active customers, SFTP and database username and passwords are exposed. Well, that's pretty awful. So if there's a database and it's they can reach it and they have the credentials to it, and that database is used by like a lot of people, some popular site, then someone would care. But for these things, like for a subset of active customers, the SSL private key was exposed. What person out there, like even in security, but like outside of security, who's going to be sitting there like freaking out about really any of this, or even caring at all? I think we would be a little overstating the impact to the average user if we said they were freaked out or cared about that too much. So
yeah. I mean, which is probably rightfully so, in this case, but it was just kind of that blip that popped up that it came from sec.gov or whatever that I saw it reported, and I didn't really hear anything about it, and so it does just feel like breach fatigue is a real thing. Yeah.
Actually, to your point, it's funny you say that, because I will purposefully go seek out news. One of the reasons being this, this podcast. And so I'll seek out news and I'll find tons of articles about breaches or just breaches and things that happen that I'm like, wait, you don't hear about any of this. You will never hear about any of this unless you seek it out. So could be that I'm not paying attention to the right feeds on Twitter or something like that, which is very likely because I'm not on there ever. But, I'm guessing though, it's more of just like not promoted heavily in the mainstream media as the term is coined now.
Yeah. I don't know. Right. Like, anyway. So that was the GoDaddy hack, whatever breach, whatever you want to call it. the other article that I brought that I wanted to talk about before we get into, the fun Thanksgiving Day plans and Black Friday sales and all of that, was actually a recent blog post from Trail of Bits. And the reason I bring this one up is because whenever we have Stefan on, we talk about symbolic execution and we talk about all of these like testing strategies and fuzzing. But at times we don't necessarily give a very good background of what it is that we're talking about. And this blog post from Trail of Bits actually is a good walkthrough of, this is a short description and exercise in what symbolic execution is and how to use these different tools that have been mentioned in the past, like Binary Ninja, Manticore. So MUI is Manticore user interface, I believe. But it's how to actually use those and get started with them and why it's important, right? So it looks like this was an intern or something at Trail of Bits that was doing some work with MUI and helping, build on top of that. But he gives a really good explanation of what symbolic execution is and why you would care about it as a security technologist, as someone that is doing something in application security. I just wanted something like, I wanted to give another resource to those that hadn't had that exposure in the past or did not have that exposure in the past.
Yeah, that's a great article.
Yeah.
No, I actually read it. Well, at least the highlights. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. So they do give a good breakdown of like basically how, states get created. So, and you assign, sort of like a symbol to that state. And anyways, they're just talking about how state explosion occurs and how this tool is, helping to address that by implementing a human back into the process who can visually see the states expand. So to make that concrete, the example they give is an if-else statement with a less than 5, greater than 5. And there's 2 separate states, right? But you can see pretty quickly if you have a lot of if-else or conditional related type statements, there's tons of operators to have conditional outcomes as well, rather than just if, else, case, when, switch, stuff like that. So and then as loops occur and processes branch off or exec separately, now you have like this state explosion that they're talking about. And so they want to give you a tool to actually, like, as these states get built out, you can see where things kind of get out of control is what I'm taking from the article, if I'm reading this right. But I liked, like you said, the description of what am I trying to say? What a symbolic execution is, and then what states are generated during that. Yep.
Yeah. It's sometimes we gloss over those terms, and I know that depending on the audience at that given time, they may or may not understand what it actually is. To Cole's point too, he's asking if I think it's how most of the commercial SaaS tools work. It's similar that a commercial SaaS tool builds out a state engine, right? And then we'll do a source to sink trace, right? The symbolic execution is almost taking the binary state, though, instead of the static state to do that, and determining where those branches exist, and then building out this symbolic execution based on what those branches are, and then testing through it. So it is a very similar approach, Cole, but they do have different tools for it based on whether or not it is dynamic or static or what have you. So it's a good one to go read up on and spend a little bit of time on. It's, some of those terms that we use, like when we're starting to do static analysis, like our course, it's a lot of what we're holding in our head, right? We're doing that almost naturally when you review code, right? You look at that simple explanation of, X is either greater than or equal to 4 or less than 4. We automatically split that out into this pathway in our head, right? We can go down one branch or we can go down another. And those are the two symbolic states or the symbolic executors that have to be run in that case. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, I've had this bite me in the past before where the conditional was written in such a way that it was so long and so hard to follow and on one line that I actually missed a problematic or statement at the end. And I don't know, is it like a side note to all of this? I do recommend, most engineers or software engineers will, you'll run linting tools, and those linting tools might have rules like, only go 80 spaces across with your comments or something like that. I think a rule like that should definitely exist for conditionals. If you're a security person and you're reviewing code, if you see crazy long conditionals, it's best to break those out. And why I say that is seriously, visually, it's very hard to, if you're doing this manually, it's very hard to read something that's very, 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 very long, which doesn't happen all the time, but it does sometimes, and it becomes very confusing to follow. So you could also just break it down by spacing it all out, and that's also an option. But probably better to have them rewrite the code.
That's gonna require me to actually get in there and rewrite the code though to break it up.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, but that's not too bad. Yeah, but it is
not
extra
too
work.
hard. I'm just being lazy.
Work.
Come on, Ken. It's fine.
No, but
don't worry about it. That's it.
I think
that's good. I'll put some crazy conditionals into VTM for you to explore next time around.
You should. And I'll just, no, seriously, the one I'm talking about was bizarrely, it wasn't good because, you can't tell what's going on. So, but I was going to mention too, with commercial tools, they also all work differently. So it's one theory that they operate off of, but some are nothing more than glorified regex. Some are, actually parsing out using the abstract syntax tree, having those node modules that get built, or the node. I'm sorry, not Node.js modules. They're literally nodes with little bits of information that get built out, and then usually that's when companies say that's they use that. They build their proprietary secret sauce on top of having parsed that out. And then that's where their logic goes from there. So you don't always know how they're doing it under the hood because it's not really something widely discussed so it just depends on the company.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting space, right? I know that, we can riff off of it for hours if we wanted to actually, see how it's analyzed and see how each of the different products goes into it, whether that is in the static space or in the dynamic or in the symbolic execution space as well. And it looks like we lost Ken. So I'm sure he'll be back shortly. That's been about how the state is going. So here, I'm going to hide this really quick before we dive into another topic. So I guess we'll bring this up really quick.
I should be joining. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you again. No video.
Okay. I'll work on the video. I apologize. I went to go switch to standing up because my leg was going numb from sitting all day. So that's when I just realized I have this camera set up differently than usual. So sorry about that. My bad. I immediately rectified the problem before it was a huge deal. So
that's fine. Cool. Good. So the next link that I was going to post in here was actually Black Friday deals for information security people. Since we all know that we don't do anything on Friday but shop, right? Apparently.
Shop and deal with breaches.
Shop and deal with breaches. But this did have a couple of things in it that I wanted to call out. And actually, they're pulling it from let me drop this other link in here from an actual GitHub repository that's tracking these.
Yes.
It's that one. I think that's being updated more than the article is in and of itself. But what you'll notice.
Hey, by the way, I just found out that if it's a law. I did not know this is a law. If I promote a GitHub service, I have to say that I work for GitHub. So in case this counts as that, I work for GitHub. Okay, sorry. Okay. Go ahead. It's not a GitHub law. Apparently, it's a law. Like,
it's a law.
It's a law.
Disclaimer.
You should know, Seth Law.
Ken works for GitHub. Okay, so the one thing I did want to call out was this Proxyman web debugging proxy for Mac OS. And I don't know if you've played with this before, Ken, if that's one that you've seen. This has been incredibly useful to me and my team over the last 6 months in performing mobile assessments, right? And I specifically because the new M1 MacBook, right, or the new M1 devices allow you to run mobile apps on your laptop or on your M1 Mac as opposed to just under iOS. And it's been super useful not to have to worry as much about jailbroken devices, even though we still have a lab of jailbroken devices that gives us a quick, easy way to analyze network traffic from any sort of a iOS application. So if you're doing mobile assessments and you haven't had a chance to run any of that on your M1 device, I would encourage you to download and install Proxyman. There's a free version as well, but the paid version gives you some additional features. It's not super expensive, all things considered, but it does allow you to target specific applications on your device and proxy that traffic. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. Right? It's been very useful to us. Anyway, so that's proxyman.io, and it's 30% off right now if you want to buy the professional version or the paid version. That was the biggest thing that I saw on that list. Yeah.
I haven't seen this before. Huh. It's pretty cool, man.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good little tool, right? Similar to, Burp Suite as it becomes more and more a part of our our assessment process. This helped out on the mobile side because we could target specific running processes and then proxy that directly to Burp. Cool, we've used it in conjunction, but it does allow some replay and some other things. There's some limited functionality that you're able to reuse with Proxyman. I still prefer Burp for a full test of the backend API, but it does give me access to that HTTP request, and I can drop it straight into Repeater or somewhere else to complete my testing, as opposed to some of the other techniques that we've used in the past. It just made it really easy.
I had a question. Two-part question. Do you have the new M1 Mac chip laptop? Also, have you used that with the simulator? I understand that it's supposed to be far more phenomenal for doing mobile test. If everybody watching can't tell, I haven't done mobile testing in years, so I'm way out of date on this stuff. But yeah, I was curious, because I heard it's supposed to be, and I mean, even my work one's my work laptop's an M1, and just using that for normal stuff seems a lot snappier. So I'm curious.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely on the iOS side of things, development wise, the simulator, because it's not at that point they don't have to simulate as much, right? They're not having to represent it. It's actually just ARM calls and on the ARM processor itself, and that's it's actually made life easier for us on the iOS testing side of things as well. We ended up getting a couple of the MacBook Pros, like the M1s, right after they came out. I mean, that's the device I'm using right now, Ken. An M1 MacBook Pro, and it's done just as well, if not better than the Intel chip that I was using in the past. So.
Yeah, that was my question, is if you did see a significant improvement, because that's what I had heard, is that it's just supposed to be phenomenal in comparison to the Intel chip ones for mobile testing specifically. So, excuse me.
Yeah, my main device is still an Intel based system on the Mac side of things that has large amounts of memory for running VMs. That is the one thing that I'm a little leery of, is the fact that then I have to move off of like Windows systems and Linux systems, and how well those are supported by VMware or whatever, other software that's out there and able to run applications and stuff on it. Nowadays, it's not as big a deal because, Kubernetes, Docker, and virtual machines up in the cloud, you can get, you can do quite a bit. But I do like having that flexibility locally. So it's a trade-off. But so far, on this device itself and for the testing purposes that we've had, the M1 has done great, right? It's made our lives a lot easier.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. I've been enjoying it just for regular stuff. It's been super snappy, but I was just curious about, how that goes. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Are you doing any interesting tests? Like, have you had anything interesting pop up?
We reviewed that cool iLike last time. So,
yeah.
Trying to think the last few days, like one of the things that I've noticed recently, and I've done a couple of these over the past 6 months, is some of the older systems that are being used by large corporations. They have us test in, QA or, test environments on a huge corporate network, and they're using some framework to develop applications. I've actually found default credentials on I'm not sure how deep I want to go, but
go as deep as you need to.
I know.
Entertain us at your own
entertain
expense.
You. Let's just say it's really easy to find default creds for most of those old, not even old, right? For frameworks and application development tools like DevSecOps tools that have been around for 10 years, right?
Famously terrible, yeah.
And half the time, I get responses back from the DevSecOps teams at these places. They're like, "Oh, that's QA, right?" And yeah, it's not like that in production. I'm like, okay, that may be the case. The problem that I have is that you're cloning QA or your test system from production, including the data that's in production. And then you're not realizing that your cloned data on this new environment that you just stood up has all those same default usernames and passwords that any instance would, that people can go and look up in the documentation, right? It's very much a, and we were talking about OWASP, like the new OWASP list yesterday, right? At our local OWASP chapter, but the insecure design, kind of insecure security misconfigurations that go into putting these tools in place are not always. These companies and these organizations just don't take that into consideration when it comes to QA and the other environments that they're using outside of production, which exposes data, exposes things to other employees. And I would even go so far as the auditing trails that exist, logging in those systems, because, most companies don't do any sort of customer obfuscation when they pull data into QA instance. They just don't. I was going to be very specific and ask you if you had seen anything like that internally. I know you guys have done stuff. Yeah.
Is that, so for GitHub, we're not putting any real prod data in anything, period. Should never get any there's too much segmentation and all that stuff. But for let's talk about Living Social. When I worked at Living Social, and if anybody remembers back that far, they were a Groupon competitor, and hopefully people remember Groupon. Is Groupon still around? I can't remember. I don't actually know.
Groupon.
I know Living Social's not. I think they got acquired by Groupon for like nothing. But anyways, you asked about the data. The data we would hold is only, it was like, I think it was either the first, say, 100 rows of each table, which then meant it was just employee data, or it was filtered out just to be employee data, which is like not great. But I mean, when I say employee data too, I'm talking about like, remember, this was a VC backed startup. So like, you had your typical engineers that kind of like all work together, like kind of like what you do in AppSec, and so you got your core folks, and it was really the core folks' information that it was real and it wasn't, if that makes any sense. So but it was at no point supposed to be customer data, right? Like it was. So I don't remember if it was a truncation that occurred, and that's why you just had like the original first core group of people that built the company in the development and staging environments, or I can't remember, but I've seen it before for sure. Now, sorry, Mike. Now, are you saying that the systems staging is connected to a database, or could potentially be exploited and then potentially have connections to a database that would hold the real prod data? Sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've run into recently. Is there is prod data in a QA instance that we're testing against, and then all the passwords aren't reset behind the scenes, and we're talking things like, oh, look, here's the administrative portal for deploying new applications to this infrastructure, and the default password is admin, right? And I'm just like, it's not even, I have to go on the web and look for what those default credentials are. It is, man, you guys just didn't do security 101 with any of this. And it's definitely just a process. It's just part of this insecure design, like the SDLC process, that you've got to be vigilant about security. I mean, at Living Social, at least there was some sort of truncation that you were running into.
Well,
but
there were other issues, but sure. Sorry. Continue. I wouldn't go patting them on the back quite yet, but anyways, continue.
I mean, at least there was something, because a lot of these large corporations, there's not anything, and it's a huge effort to actually go through and obfuscate data. I know there's companies out there that'll do that for you. That'll take your data and obfuscate it and change names and change everything in a data set if you're concerned about it. But most companies, as they grow up, that's not necessarily a concern until it has to be, right? But most of it, like you would be surprised. It's most of these companies are large organizations that you would think had to figure it out for compliance reasons, and apparently it's just never come up, right? It's out of scope, I guess, right? I don't know.
I think it comes down to risk tolerance, because it's always interesting to things, and this is a dichotomy. So we talk about when we train people, but just in regular, AppSec life, I can honestly say that I can ask an engineer, like, what parts of this new service or feature you're developing, and they're going to give me usually very accurate descriptions of where the real risk is. Like, I'll do my own assessment of that, of course, but typically they're right on the money on where the real risk was. There is a dichotomy, though, where there are situations, certainly, where it comes to like architecture that's outside of maybe what the core piece of that project that an engineer is looking at, that they know very well, but just like zooming out from that, like the core architecture, where then you get into a sort of like threat model risk situation, and it can get a little wonky, where people like what they're worried about and what they think is a risk versus like the practical actual risks that we would see just from like, okay, well, if somebody escalated here, where could they get next? From there, where could they go next? You know what I mean? Like the layered approach and where to. But it's interesting because a lot of times, you'll get some pretty far out there ideas of like where risk would be. Doesn't touch the practical stuff whatsoever. So it's weird. It's kind of a weird thing. And I think that has to do with like I said, an engineer can be very amazing at the one thing that they're focused on, but then if it's part of a larger, like in this instance, infrastructure, well, maybe the software engineers aren't even touching that infrastructure. Maybe it's just like, let me make sure all this stuff connects to the things. And then SRE is supposed to do what they do. And they're more maybe worried about redundancy or uptime or optimizations or whatever. So it's like everybody becomes a little bit disconnected from the core of what this thing is and how to assess risk properly in it. And that's where security is interesting. And I talked to a manager. Sorry, but this was interesting. I actually was like, what can I say about this? I was talking to somebody who today actually, who was, we were talking about management things, had a really unique perspective looking at what we do, in that we don't look at those individual pieces of what people build. We look at the end to end, and that's hard. That's a hard thing to do because you have to grasp the complete picture and all of the things that, make up that picture to then dig in and look at like weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So anyways, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And
because that's the truth, right? We have to understand the complete picture of something before we can even understand like what could be going wrong with it. Whereas if you look at SRE, or you look at the DevOps folks, or you look at the engineers, they're looking at their scope of that project, not the entirety of the project. Not that's a broad stroke statement. I get it, but I'm just like, in general.
Yeah. And okay. So, and this is what I wanted to go back to, right? Is like, I find myself, like, we have our like Circle K framework, right, for code reviews, but it's very much also like a lot of those actions are applicable for like dynamic reviews or any sort of manual penetration test, manual assessment of an application, right? So these vulnerabilities I found with these endpoints, right? There's an admin portal that's accessible. The only way that I actually found those was looking at the profile of the application, seeing that it was making calls and using specific like cookie patterns, Googling what those cookie patterns corresponded to, realized that they were using a specific framework, and then enumerating out what the default install and default apps and default functionality of that framework actually was. And you'd be surprised how much you can uncover about any running application using those same sort of just logical steps about, that's weird. I've seen this before in XYZ situation, or wow, this is using, JSF, files, right? Java server frame or Java server faces. And that wasn't one that it was, but like things like that you haven't seen before, you scratch that itch until you're able to understand what's going on with an application. And if you like, it's worth the time up front to put in that effort. That's what I want you to understand. Even on like the bug bounty side of things, if you understand the application, that stuff pops up a lot more easily than it does if I'm just throwing like every endpoint at every fuzz list at a specific endpoint, right? It just, that takes a long time. And the amount of success I have to actual vulnerabilities and actual flaws is pretty minuscule. Like it's a small percentage of, I took the 2 hours instead of scanning, I went and read the documentation, and now I'm able to find X, Y, and Z and secure an application, as opposed to, wow, I just spent 2 hours scanning that application and I found the stuff that I found in the first 10 minutes of looking at it, right?
Yeah. I mean, we have a hard it's a hard job to do for that reason. You do have to look at the totality. Actually, something you you said made me think of when you mentioned fuzzing. There was a question in our last video, which I thought maybe we could address. It was, could you provide more detail on what type of, okay, so this is going back to the conversation, and actually what DevSecCon, which we'll put a link into, both Seth and I did a lightning talk. Seth did a lightning talk on secure code reviews. I did a lightning talk on, this was this week, or was that last week?
That's last week, yeah.
Okay, it was last week. Sorry. At the tail end, I think, of last week. So you did a talk on secure code reviews. I did a talk that was an extended version of where my head was at with, in terms of testing, optimizing testing when you're dealing with like service-oriented architectures, to include microservices, which that's what this question's about the things that I had talked about, or you and I had both talked about. But I figured I could answer this one because I know this is specific to the thing I specifically was talking about, which is, could you provide more detail on what type of fuzzing you believe will help suss out vulnerabilities in the microservices pattern? Is it fuzzing for the desynchronization of HTTP request formats? Example, fuzzing the CL content length and TE transfer encoding headers to see how those might allow for request smuggling, or are you fuzzing the body of the request? No, I think it's everything in the request, from the path to the body to the headers, that need to be fuzzed, period. And that's why, right? Because that's the issue, is that it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's going to go wrong, especially from a source code perspective, in terms of specifically as it pertains to, weird like proxy behavior or front end behavior. So weird behavior between the front end and the back end, and then certain components of that request being handled differently on the front end than the back end. And that's the issue, is you don't always know what part is, what part's going to fail, right? So, but for specifically, if you're talking about desynchronization, or if you're talking about request smuggling bits, that's the, in James Carroll's article, he talks about fuzzing those specific headers and how to do it also without being destructive, which is pretty cool, to cause a timeout. And then based off the being able to adjust the timeout, it's kind of like testing for blind SQL injection. You cause a timeout, and then, based on the response time, you know whether or not what you're doing is impacting the system that you can't really see an output from. So yes, I think that's part of it. I think it's also stuff like I said, like SSRF's a big one, and then there are just straight up oddities that and it's not always like, it's not like just a standard technology that's used on the front end, like a load balancer or proxy or something like that, Nginx, whatever. It's not like that. It's not that I think that there are mass issues in those technologies. I actually think the bigger problem is when people create, say, their own custom front end that has like authentication or authorization, or one of the two, or whatever. Like maybe it's a multi-layered set of systems, but then those systems are like the wall that people interact with, and behind them are all the other systems that are taking basically whatever the user did, and then possibly that input being placed into those back-end systems, and there being like different components of the requests that are being parsed out differently on the front end and the back end. And there's more details coming out more recently about the NPM thing, and that'll probably clear up some of what I'm talking about, because it feels a little abstract right now. But this is actually like a more prevalent thing that I'm seeing. So I'm trying to make sure, does that sound like I answered that, Seth? Okay. Or like, are there still some things you would add to that? I mean, I'm sure there's things you're thinking of as I'm talking.
Yeah. I mean, from a fuzzing perspective, it's hard to say, only one of those two things is, one is more important than the other. But exactly to your point, because we see flaws in both places, right? Okay, how is this microservice that I'm directly interacting with actually handling the body that's being sent to it, right? On that specific endpoint. But then there's also, is there any sort of infrastructure in between my browser and that microservice that I'm interacting with. And that's where those headers come into play. The TE and the CL stuff, the content length, transfer encoding, request smuggling that can happen along those lines. And then there's components of, hey, that API is then interacting with yet again another API behind the scenes that doesn't have authorization or authentication on it because it's assumed that everything is trusted. And we've got a proxy in between there. So in my testing, just in the last 3 to 4 months, I've seen flaws in each of those layers. And so we're doing a disservice as testers if we just decide, hey, I'm just going to go check for the CLTE vulnerabilities, the request smuggling, as opposed to how the application is handling data, where it's sending something else off to from an SSRF perspective, or even just I found second order, third order insecure direct object reference in the past, right, where the middle API is proxying data to an admin API behind the scenes, but they're just passing through an integer all the way. And as long as I knew where that integer was, like the initial request was one integer, but then there was also in the post body that was going to a second location behind the scenes. And all of a sudden I'm seeing somebody else's data. Right. And those sorts of edge cases is exactly what we're trying to suss out and what we're trying to find based on our experience and our knowledge of what that integration looks like. So that was a long answer I think I agree. Right. But
but this is actually like going back to our original part of this conversation where we talked about like the totality of things. Like that's our job, to understand the totality of things. That's actually what you're talking about is exactly my point. It's that, if you look at just one of those systems that were in that multi-system flow, you're going to miss that piece. Even if you do the most excellent code review of excellent code reviews that you do, Seth, you're still going to miss it. It's still going to be a problematic thing. You're not going to see like the end-to-end. You don't have the total picture. And I think that there are specific classes of vulns that we are better off doing runtime testing from an end-to-end perspective than we'll ever be reviewing the source code. I think what's more likely is that you'll see runtime detection detecting some variance, and that being your hint to go digging deeper. And then that's when you look at the code to figure out what the actual root cause is. But certainly detection is going to be better at the in the runtime and faster.
Well,
and more likely.
And to that point, right? Like these vulnerabilities that I'm talking about with like default frameworks, security misconfigurations, it's very hard to identify those in source code, right? It's some dynamic environment that an SRE or somebody else has put together that the developer loads their code onto. They probably have no idea that it exists. So there's no way that I would have found, 2 or 3 of those in the code itself, because it didn't have anything to do with the configuration file. It had to do with how the administrators stood up those environments. And that, and the same thing goes with a lot of these other integration points. I don't think there's any easy way to do that. Yes, we talk about infrastructure as code, and some of that we could suss out, but it's very rare that, especially these legacy frameworks, these code bases that are these developer tools that have been around for 20, 25 years, there's no infrastructure as code when it comes to that. It's basically, hey, go download this jar file and run it, right? And then you go in and reset the password manually. And if you forget to do that step, it doesn't get reset. That's what it boils down to, right?
Oof. Yeah. Yikes. Not great.
Yeah.
Not great.
It's not great. It's not all just Tomcat. And like in the discussions that I have with people, it's very interesting, like our local OWASP chapter, because we have some gray hairs that are in there that have seen like legacy COBOL mainframe system, old Java code, right? They have to deal with it on a daily basis. And then we get those like idealist, like new students that are straight out of college, developers working at a startup, and they're like, well, it's fine. You just go upgrade the whole, the whole framework that is supporting your application. And I'm like, hold on a second there, because yeah, I mean, it's experience is what it boils down to, right? Like, but that, I don't know.
The answer is, I will say, I do agree with them, but
I do.
I think that, then you have to look at like, well, what's it gonna take to get there? How long out is that?
What is it going to cost?
What can we do in the interim? Yeah.
Well,
what can we do in the interim that's realistic?
Yeah, I found myself saying that's great, but when that cost of upgrading that library requires you to upgrade the mainframe and requires you to upgrade all these pieces in between, and end up costing the company $50 million, is that an acceptable amount for you to spend to eliminate, a low to medium risk vulnerability? Right? Like it's just that prioritization needs to happen, and it's easy to discount old legacy systems when you haven't been dealing with them for years. That's all.
Yeah. And on that note, if you haven't read it yet, and I'm one of millions of people I'm sure that have told you this, but not you, Seth. I'm just this to the viewers. If you have not read it yet, you should read the Phoenix Project. It's pretty interesting. I think it gives good perspective, and without you having to actually go through that misery. So if you're early on in your career and you haven't read the Phoenix Project, start there. It'll give you a good idea of the dynamics of a company, and also maybe some perspective on how we're seen from the lens of non-security people trying to accomplish business goals. So yeah, I think it's helpful.
It is. It's good, right? Anyway, so I know we've ranted for a while today.
Yeah, I got to get to jiu-jitsu here in a little bit. Got practice.
Oh yes, yeah. Ken's got real things to do.
I got to go choke people for fun, or get choked. We'll see how it goes.
With how the day's going, I'm assuming the latter, not the four.
Probably the latter. I'm probably getting choked out with my own gi tonight, so we'll see how it goes.
Sweet. Well, everybody, we will be here next week, so please join us. If you've got specific topics you would like us to address, we should have a date next week for our code review project, or our code review evening with Seth and Ken, whatever we want to call it. And we'll set up a forum so you can suggest projects that you want us to take a look at.
It'll probably look a lot like this at us at night, but us at night, maybe a tasty adult beverage in hand.
Woohoo! It's going to be fun. I'm excited. New code bases are always fun. So good. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks everybody for joining today. Thanks for the interaction, and we'll catch everybody next week.
Bye. Thanks.